Another way to make wispy clouds in Vue is to use the feathering. And feathering is kind of interesting and has some different ways it works. Let's go ahead and open up the atmosphere editor, and I'm using start scene number 2. And we're going to add in one of the Spectral 2 clouds. Let's go ahead and use the puffy cumulus. And we'll make some adjustments to the layer. Bring the altitude down to a kilometer and the height to about 1.3 kilometers. And if we go into the material, I'm going to edit the function and just change this over to the Perlin noise gradient. Go ahead and use ridged. Delete the brightness and contrast. And I'm going to set my scaling, roughness, variations, and uniformity all to 50. Remove my custom cloud layer profile and set function scale to 1 all the way across. And I just want to decrease the cover a little so we can start to see the layer a little bit better. And what I'm going to do is, right now the feather is set to 9%. And there's something that is interesting that happens with the feathers, is you can raise it up to a rather high amount with a minimal amount of change, just to spread it out a bit more. Once you hit 100%, it will invert the entire function and probably produce some of the better wispy clouds. So we can start to reduce our cover after we hit that point. So with feathers at 100%, and you will not be able to go beyond 100%. A lot of the other sliders you can type in a value much higher. Feathers will max out at 100%. And there's quite a bit of grain in here, so there's a few other adjustments that will need to be made. You can start to see some of the wispy areas coming out. Increase our cover over 50%. Go into the material and reset that filter because it was causing just a few issues. I also want to change the scale, bring it down to 1. And might as well bring it down to 0.5. And take our detail amount, let's go ahead and bring it up to 50. So you can start to see the different areas kind of being pulled out. It is a rather interesting effect that happens. Now, because it doesn't invert, what we will need to do is go into the function and select the link between that gradient and the density, add in a filter, and we're going to use the opposite filter. And that way we can preserve the original shape and placement of the clouds, and then increase our cover amount. And you can see the effect a little more clearly now. There's also quite a bit of grain showing, and that is caused primarily by there not being enough information around the edges of the cloud. So what I want to do is reduce the sharpness amount, decrease density, increase the opacity, remove some of those altitude variations in the ambient lighting. And if we go into the function for the density, what I want to do is filter out just some of these areas. So I'm going to add in a filter and use the brightness and contrast. So mainly just increasing the contrast amount, and we can brighten it up to give us more of a finite amount of overall density. And then we can increase the cover. Go ahead and take a look at that. So it is starting to look a little bit better around the edges. However, the overall shape of the cloud itself is not looking all that great. So what I want to do is go into the material and bring down the uniformity slider. Might as well go ahead and increase the scale on the Y to 2, so we can stretch it out, make it a little more realistic, so it's moving with the wind. And if we want, we can also increase the detail. And we should start to see something a little more interesting looking. Because there are still some areas that aren't really being cut out properly, one of the things we could do is increase the Z scale for the density production to give it more of an absolute amount for the height. So if we edit the material, take that Z scale, let's go ahead and bring it up to 2.5. And then if we need to, we can decrease the overall height of the layer, start to bring that down. And if we decrease the cover, we should start to see more of a subtraction for the feathers. So this is going to be more of a limited layer now. It renders fairly quickly, looks pretty nice. It's getting a little wispy. And if I increase the height a little bit more, we can start to fill it in and raise the clouds up a little higher. And then going into the function itself, adjusting that brightness and contrast in order to fill it in more rather than using the cover. But it does create a nice looking shape around the clouds and up on top. And depending on the altitude variation, go ahead and set that to 0. We can end up with some pretty nice looking clouds. Increase the cover a little bit more if we want to fill that in. And we might need to raise or drop down the layer. Let's go ahead and bring it to 500 meters so we can get a little bit closer to some of these clouds that are within the scene. So overall, those don't look too bad. If I wanted, I could take the height and decrease it, increase the cover a little bit more. And I'm going to go ahead and probably raise up the height slightly higher altitude, but lowering the height of the cloud will really just kind of clip it out and show more of the wispy area. If you're seeing too much of the shape of the noise, or whatever you're using to control the density, it means that the cover amount is set too high. So what we can do is reduce the cover amount, increase the height slightly, and just kind of fill that in. So if I wanted to fill up more of the sky, I would need to go into this function and just kind of lower the contrast a little, be able to fill in a lot more of the sky without those harsh edges showing. And the size of that feathering that's going to show up is going to be very much dependent on the material scale. So we could increase the material scale. Let's go ahead and bring it up to, let's say, 3. And now take a look. And what you're seeing is a lot of grain. And that's because the area that is showing, there currently is not enough density to cause proper lighting. So we would increase the height, fill it in a little bit more. If needed, we could filter out the altitude slightly, or decrease cover amount, and then we should be able to cut out those edges. So let's go ahead and decrease the cover so that we can still see the clouds in the preview on the side. Increase height a little, We can adjust the density or the detail amount. Maybe add a little bit of altitude variation, and then going into the filter, just kind of cut out more of those bottom areas. And it looks like we still kind of in the wrong area, showing the distant clouds look pretty good. The more your scale gets increased for your cloud layer, the more likely you're going to run into these sort of density grain problems. The farther away you are, it looks pretty good overall. So we might even need to just decrease the scaling of the detail layer. But this could be possibly caused by really just the brightness and contrast filter. And you can also see a lot of grain outside of the cloud, which means that part of that cloud is still showing over the sky. It's just not being cut out properly. So what I might need to do is go back into that filter and just remove that top point and just clip it out on the bottom. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. And it looks like it's cutting out a little bit too much. So sometimes I'm just going to go ahead and reset the filter. Depending on what sort of function you have, you may need to modify some of these settings and kind of tweak them a bit to get it to show up without any grain. So it looks like leaving just that upper part of the filter in there seemed to work out a little bit better. You can see a nice little bits of wisp showing up in the top. And we could just adjust the cover and height to limit the effect a little bit more. And overall, I think it looks pretty interesting. Another source or cause for that grain is also the fact that we are using a larger material scale on the Z, which is going to stretch out some of the low range areas. So if we bring it down to 0.5, we should be able to see a reduced amount of noise. Of course, we're not really directly under the layer anymore. And we'll see if there's anything kind of around us. If not, we can just move the camera. And we'll just go ahead and take a look at one of these from above. And it is a fairly interesting effect from being above the cloud. Raising the height probably would make it look a little bit better. Let's go ahead and just point the camera up. And now we can take a look underneath. So it doesn't look too bad. Keeping in mind that that is with that very large scale. We could also reduce it. Let's go ahead and use 0.2. And now we have more of a large scale effect. A lot of little feathers and wispiness going around the clouds. There are some kind of harsh cutoffs within the material. So I would go ahead and set the Z scale to 1. And then what I can do is reduce the height. And that should help remove any of those problematic areas. And that definitely looks a lot better. So just another neat way to create wispy clouds. And if I went and took that feathering and just brought it even down to 99%, it will change the look, but quite a bit. And once you reach a certain point, it will go back and invert itself. And it does appear that that is somewhat dependent on the scale and the overall detail amount, whether or not it inverts. Right now it's a fairly even step down without any feathers at all. You can see pretty nice looking cloud layer. So if you wanted something a little more uniform, this would also work out pretty well for that too. So I'll go ahead and save this out. And I'm going to call this Start Scene 2 Wispy. So you can load it in and take a look, and that's with the feathering set to 100%.